Rock history is full of artists who reached the top and stayed there. But the stories nobody talks about enough are the ones that happened in between. The years of silence, the bankruptcies, the addiction, the grief, the public humiliation, and the moments where everything these artists had built simply collapsed around them.
What did I see?
Tonight, we are counting down 12 rock legends who lost everything. Their money, their voices, their bandmates, their relevance, and in some cases, their will to continue. And then came back bigger than anyone thought possible. By the time we reach number 1, you will understand that the greatest rock comebacks in history weren't just musical achievements. They were acts of pure, defiant survival. Number 12, Meat Loaf, I'd do anything for love, but I won't do that.
No way, and I would do it.
Bat Out of Hell, released in 1977, was one of the most unlikely commercial successes in rock history. A theatrical, operatic album that every major label had rejected before a small, independent company took the risk of releasing it.
Anything for love, and I'll take
The album eventually sold tens of millions of copies worldwide and made Meat Loaf one of the most recognizable voices in rock music almost overnight. What followed that success, however, was a collapse so complete and so public that it seemed to permanently close the door on everything the album had opened.
that.
The first problem was his voice. While attempting to record a follow-up to Bat Out of Hell, Meat Loaf lost his voice entirely. Not temporarily, not partially, but completely, for an extended period that left him unable to record or perform at all. The cause was never definitively established, but the timing was catastrophic, arriving precisely when the music industry expected him to capitalize on the momentum of one of the best-selling debut albums ever made.
Free for soul. Some days I just pray to the God.
The silence that followed was deafening, and the albums he eventually managed to release during this period, without his creative partner Jim Steinman, and without the full power of his voice, failed commercially and critically.
Anything for love.
The second problem was legal. Over 40 separate lawsuits were filed against him during this period, involving disputes over royalties, contracts, and creative ownership that consumed his finances and his energy simultaneously. Bankruptcy followed, stripping away the financial rewards of the very album that had made him famous. By the mid-1980s, Meat Loaf had gone from selling out arenas to playing smaller venues, fighting legal battles, and watching his career dissolve in real time. The comeback arrived in 1993 with Bat Out of Hell 2, Back into Hell, reuniting him with Jim Steinman after years of estrangement and legal conflict between the two. The album debuted at number 1 in multiple countries and produced I'd Do Anything for Love, But I Won't Do That, which became a global number 1 single and earned Meat Loaf his first and only Grammy Award for Best Rock Vocal Performance.
We don't go all the way.
The man who had lost his voice, his money, and his career had come back 16 years later with the best-selling album of his entire life, proving that some careers don't end. They simply wait for the right moment to explode again. Number 11, Santana, Smooth, featuring Rob Thomas. Carlos Santana's story is one of the most dramatic commercial revivals in the history of popular music, made more remarkable by the fact that it happened not in the years immediately following his peak, but nearly 3 decades after it. Santana had been one of the defining acts of the late 1960s and early 1970s, blending Latin rhythms with rock guitar in a way that was genuinely new and genuinely exciting. And his performance at Woodstock in 1969 remains one of the most celebrated sets in that festival's history. By the mid-1980s and through the 1990s, however, Santana had largely faded from mainstream commercial relevance, continuing to tour and record, but failing to reach the audiences that had made him a household name 2 decades earlier. The turnaround began with a conversation between Santana and Clive Davis, the legendary record executive who had signed him to Columbia Records at the beginning of his career and who now approached him about a new project built around collaborations with younger contemporary artists. Santana was initially uncertain about the concept, worried that pairing his guitar work with pop and hip-hop influenced artists might feel inauthentic or commercially calculated in a way that would alienate his core audience without winning a new one. What emerged from that uncertainty was Supernatural, released in 1999, featuring collaborations with Rob Thomas, Everlast, Dave Matthews, and Lauryn Hill, among others. The album sold over 30 million copies worldwide, spent 12 weeks at #1 on the Billboard 200, and won 9 Grammy Awards in a single night. A record tied only by Michael Jackson. Smooth, the collaboration with Rob Thomas, became one of the most played songs on American radio in the entire decade. Carlos Santana was 52 years old when Supernatural was released, and he had just produced the biggest commercial achievement of his entire career. Number 10, Tina Turner, What's Love Got to Do with It? Tina Turner's personal story is one of the most extraordinary in the history of popular music, and it begins not with a professional setback, but with something far more serious. Years of documented physical abuse at the hands of her husband and musical partner, Ike Turner, a relationship she finally ended in 1978 by walking away from a limousine after a fight, arriving at a hotel with 36 cents and a mobile credit card as her only resources. She left behind not just the relationship, but the entire professional infrastructure built around it. The band, the bookings, the record contracts, and the commercial identity she had spent years building. It's physical. The early years of her solo career were deeply difficult. 3 of her first 4 solo albums failed to chart meaningfully, and she spent a period playing smaller venues and variety television appearances to support herself financially, opening for other acts, and taking whatever work was available, while the music industry largely treated her as a former star whose best years were behind her. David Bowie, who had remained a friend and admirer throughout this period, helped broker a new deal with Capitol Records that gave her the commercial infrastructure she needed to attempt a proper comeback. Private Dancer, released in 1984, was the result of that opportunity. An album that sold 20 million copies worldwide, produced the #1 single, What's Love Got to Do With It, and earned 4 Grammy Awards in a single night. Tina Turner was 44 years old when the album was released in an industry that had already decided her career was over, and she responded by producing the most commercially successful record of her entire life. She went on to become one of the highest-grossing touring artists of the 1980s and 1990s, eventually performing for a world record stadium audience. The woman who left a limousine with 36 cents became one of the most successful solo artists in rock history. Number 9, Eric Clapton, Tears in Heaven, MTV Unplugged. By the early 1990s, Eric Clapton's career had reached a complicated place. He was universally respected as one of the greatest guitarists in rock history, with a catalog spanning decades and a reputation that placed him alongside Hendrix and Page in virtually every serious conversation about the instrument. But his commercial relevance had faded. His personal life had been marked by decades of severe alcohol and drug addiction that had affected both his music and his relationships, and in April 1991, a tragedy struck that would have broken most people entirely. His 4-year-old son, Connor, fell from a 53rd floor window in a New York apartment building and died. Here in heaven. Clapton retreated from public life in the immediate aftermath of Connor's death, processing a grief so profound that his ability or desire to continue making music at all was genuinely uncertain. When he returned, it was through an invitation to record an acoustic session for MTV Unplugged. A format that stripped away the elaborate production of conventional rock recordings and placed the artist alone with his instrument in front of a live audience. Clapton agreed and performed a set that drew from across his entire career, including a deeply personal new song called Tears in Heaven, written about Connor, which he had initially been reluctant to share publicly. The MTV Unplugged album became one of the best-selling live albums in the history of the format, winning 6 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year, Record of the Year, and Song of the Year for Tears in Heaven. Beyond. It introduced Clapton's music to an entirely new generation of listeners and re-established him as a major commercial force in a way that none of his previous decades' work had managed. A performance born from the most devastating loss of his life became both the most personal thing he had ever recorded and the most commercially successful album of his career. If you are enjoying this, do well to like, share, and subscribe to Keep Connected.
Number 8, Aerosmith, Walk This Way, Run DMC featuring Aerosmith.
1, 2, 3, 4.
By the mid-1980s, Aerosmith had become one of the most cautionary tales in rock music. A band that had reached genuine creative and commercial heights in the 1970s with albums like Toys in the Attic and Rocks, only to spend the following decade in a spiral of addiction so severe that the music had essentially stopped. Steven Tyler and Joe Perry's drug and alcohol consumption had become so extreme that Perry left the band in 1979 following a backstage altercation between their wives. And guitarist Brad Whitford followed him out of the door in 1981. The remaining members attempted to continue with replacement guitarists, but the albums released during this period were commercially and critically unsuccessful. And the band's original lineup reunion in 1984 initially changed little.
There's backseat lover that's always undercover, and I talk to my daddy.
The turning point came from an unexpected source. In 1986, Run DMC approached the band about re-recording Walk This Way as a hip-hop collaboration, and Tyler and Perry's initial reaction was resistance. They had no particular connection to hip-hop culture and were uncertain whether the project made creative sense. The resulting track became one of the most significant crossover moments in popular music history, reintroducing Aerosmith to an entire generation of listeners who had never heard their original 1975 recording, and exposing hip-hop to rock audiences simultaneously. The band used the momentum from that collaboration to get clean, entering rehabilitation programs and beginning work on Permanent Vacation, released in 1987, which became their biggest commercial album since the 1970s. The albums that followed, Pump and Get a Grip, each outsold the previous one, with Get a Grip eventually selling over 20 million copies worldwide. Aerosmith in the 1990s were bigger, more commercially successful, and more culturally visible than they had been at their peak in the 1970s. A comeback built on sobriety, a hip-hop collaboration they almost refused, and a determination to prove that the band's best years were still ahead of them. Number 7, Johnny Cash. Hurt, Johnny Cash.
To see if I...
Johnny Cash's career in the 1980s and early 1990s had reached a place that nobody who had witnessed his dominance of American music in the previous 3 decades would have predicted. Cash had been one of the most significant figures in American popular music since the 1950s, a foundational voice in country, rock and roll, and gospel whose influence extended far beyond any single genre.
Beneath the stains.
By the 1980s, however, the music industry had moved on. Radio formats had changed, and Cash found himself increasingly unable to secure the commercial support that had previously been available to him. His label, Columbia Records, dropped him in 1986 after 3 decades, a rejection that Cash himself described as one of the most painful moments of his professional life.
I still feel
the years that followed were marked by declining commercial visibility, ongoing health problems related to years of substance abuse, and a sense among the music industry that Cash belonged to a previous era rather than the current one. He continued performing and recording, but without the infrastructure of a major label behind him, the reach of his music was significantly diminished. When producer Rick Rubin approached Cash about recording a series of stripped-down albums for his American Recordings label, the music industry's initial reaction was largely one of bafflement.
I will let
American Recordings, released in 1994, was recorded with Cash performing alone with an acoustic guitar, an arrangement of almost radical simplicity that placed his voice and his songwriting at the absolute center of the listening experience. The album won the Grammy for Best Contemporary Folk Album and reintroduced Cash to critical audiences who had dismissed him as a commercial relic.
will let you down.
The subsequent American 4, The Man Comes Around, featured his devastating cover of Hurt, accompanied by a music video depicting Cash's age and fragility with an unflinching honesty that became one of the most viewed and discussed music videos of its era. Named the greatest music video of all time by NME, Cash died in September 2003, but the final decade of his career had been the most critically acclaimed of his entire life. Number 6, David Bowie, Heroes. David Bowie.
'Cause of lovers.
David Bowie's commercial relevance in the 1990s and early 2000s had declined significantly from the heights of his earlier career. He had spent the 1970s and early 1980s as one of the most significant and consistently innovative figures in rock music, reinventing himself with each album and influencing virtually every major artistic movement in popular music during that period. But the mid-1990s had seen him experiment with drum and bass and electronic music in ways that confused longtime fans and failed to attract new ones. And by the 2000s, he had largely stepped back from public life following a heart attack during a 2004 concert that curtailed a world tour.
You can be me.
For nearly a decade, Bowie was almost entirely absent from the public eye, giving no interviews, releasing no new music, and making no public appearances. The music industry had largely begun treating him as a legacy act, important historically, but no longer an active creative force in contemporary music. His silence was so complete and so extended that when the next day was announced in January 2013, the announcement itself became one of the most significant music news stories of the year, not because of what the album contained, but simply because David Bowie had returned when nobody expected him to. The next day debuted at #1 in multiple countries and became his first chart-topping album in 20 years. What followed was even more remarkable. In January 2016, 2 days after his 69th birthday, and 2 days after releasing his final album, Black Star, Bowie died of liver cancer. It emerged that he had known about his illness for 18 months while continuing to work, creating an album that served simultaneously as his artistic statement and his farewell. The decade-long absence had ended with two of the most acclaimed albums of his entire career, released in the final years of his life. Number 5, Heart Alone, Heart. Heart's trajectory through the 1980s represents one of the most complete commercial reinventions in rock history, following a period of genuine creative and commercial difficulty that threatened to end the band's career entirely. Ann and Nancy Wilson had built Heart into one of the most successful rock acts of the mid to late 1970s on the strength of albums like Dreamboat Annie and Little Queen, establishing themselves as two of the most talented musicians in rock at a time when female rock artists were still relatively rare at the commercial level they were achieving. By the early 1980s, however, a combination of label changes, creative disagreements, and a shift in public taste away from the style of rock Heart had been making left the band commercially stranded. Albums released during this period failed to perform at the level of their earlier work, and the band's future as a major commercial force seemed genuinely uncertain. The solution they eventually pursued was a dramatic stylistic shift. A move toward the polished, heavily produced arena rock sound that was dominating commercial radio in the mid-1980s, working with outside songwriters and producers in a way that represented a significant departure from the more organic approach of their earlier albums. Heart, their self-titled 1985 album, became their commercial breakthrough at a completely different level from anything they had previously achieved, producing multiple top 10 singles and establishing the band as one of the dominant acts of the era. What About Love, Never, and These Dreams all became massive hits, and the band's commercial success continued through the rest of the decade, with Alone becoming their first #1 single in 1987. The Wilson sisters had transformed Heart from a struggling act into one of the biggest-selling rock bands of the 1980s, proving that reinvention, when executed with genuine commitment, can produce results that exceed an artist's original peak. Number 4, Iron Maiden, The Number of the Beast. Iron Maiden.
What did I see?
Bruce Dickinson's departure from Iron Maiden in 1993 was not an amicable split. The band's drummer Nico McBrain was publicly vocal about his relief at seeing Dickinson leave, and the general atmosphere surrounding the end of that era of the band's history was one of tension and mutual exhaustion, rather than any kind of creative resolution. Dickinson had been the voice of Iron Maiden's most successful period, fronting the band through albums like The Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, and Power Slave. And his absence left a gap that the band's subsequent albums, with replacement vocalist Blaze Bayley, struggled to fill. Bailey era produced two studio albums, The X Factor and Virtual 11, which were the least commercially and critically successful albums in Iron Maiden's entire catalog, failing to maintain the band's global audience at the level they had achieved during the Dickinson years. Ticket sales declined, critical reception was muted, and the band's position at the top of the heavy metal world, which had seemed unassailable throughout the 1980s, was genuinely under threat for the first time. Dickinson's return in 1999, following a reconciliation process that required genuine humility from all parties involved, was accompanied by guitarist Adrian Smith, who had also previously left the band, expanding the lineup to include 3 guitarists. The resulting album, Brave New World, released in 2000, debuted in the top 5 in multiple countries and was met with critical acclaim that matched the best work of the band's classic period.
Was blank. I needed time.
What followed was arguably the most successful sustained run in Iron Maiden's entire history. A series of commercially successful albums, record-breaking world tours, and a global audience that had grown rather than diminished during the years of uncertainty. Number 3, Def Leppard. Pour Some Sugar on Me. Def Leppard. The story of Def Leppard's comeback is inseparable from the story of Rick Allen, and the story of Rick Allen is one of the most remarkable in rock history. On New Year's Eve 1984, Allen lost control of his car on a road near Sheffield, England, and the resulting accident cost him his left arm. He was 21 years old at the beginning of what should have been the most productive years of his career, and the conventional wisdom in the music industry was immediate and unambiguous. Def Leppard would need a new drummer. The band refused that conclusion. Allen spent over a year working with a custom electronic drum kit that could be operated with his feet compensating for what his left arm could no longer do, rebuilding his entire approach to an instrument he had been playing since childhood from the ground up. The band waited for him, declining to replace him or continue without him, and Allen returned to performing publicly in 1986, just over a year after the accident, to a standing ovation from an audience of 80,000 people at the Monsters of Rock Festival at Donington Park. Hysteria, released in 1987, was the album that followed 3 years of rehabilitation, legal battles with their previous producer, and recording sessions of extraordinary complexity and duration. It sold 25 million copies worldwide, produced 7 top 10 singles from a single album, a record for a rock act at the time, and established Def Leppard as one of the most commercially dominant rock bands of the late 1980s. Pour Some Sugar on Me, which was written and recorded in a single afternoon after years of elaborate studio work on everything else, became the band's signature song and one of the most played rock anthems of the decade. A drummer who had been told he would never play again had just played on one of the best-selling rock albums in history. Number 2, AC/DC, Back in Black. AC/DC. Bon Scott died on the 19th of February, 1980. He was found unconscious in a friend's car in London after a night of heavy drinking and died before reaching the hospital. He was 33 years old, and he had been the voice and personality around which AC/DC had been built since 1974. The raw, gravelly, irreverent frontman whose delivery had made albums like Highway to Hell one of the most exciting hard rock records of the 1970s. His death left the remaining members facing a question that had no obvious answer, and the music industry's expectation was that AC/DC, as anyone knew them, was finished. Malcolm and Angus Young made their decision within weeks. They reached out to Brian Johnson, the vocalist of a relatively obscure British band called Geordie, who had been briefly considered for the AC/DC role years before Bon Scott was chosen. Johnson flew to London, auditioned in a small rehearsal studio, and was offered the job the same day. He was given lyrics that Scott had left partially written and material the band had been developing before the death, and asked to complete what someone else had started under the weight of an entire band's grief and an entire fan base's skepticism. Back in Black, recorded in Nassau in the spring of 1980 and released just 5 months after Scott's death, became the second best-selling album in the history of recorded music across all genres, behind only Michael Jackson's Thriller. The album opened with a single tolling bell, a deliberate tribute to Scott, and then crashed into one of the most powerful hard rock records ever made, recorded in 6 weeks by a band that had just lost the person most people considered irreplaceable. Brian Johnson has now fronted AC/DC for over 4 decades, longer than Bon Scott ever did, and the band's commercial dominance has never seriously wavered. The comeback that seemed impossible became the greatest chapter of the band's entire story. Number 1, Elvis Presley, Jailhouse Rock. Elvis Presley, 1968 comeback special.
Down at the end of Lower Street at Heartbreak Disc
By 1968, Elvis Presley's cultural relevance was genuinely questioned in a way that would have seemed unthinkable. He had spent most of the 1960s making formulaic Hollywood films and their accompanying soundtracks, a commercial strategy driven largely by his national pop partner that had kept him financially successful, but creatively stagnant during the most artistically exciting decade in rock music history.
I'm all shook up.
While the Beatles were rewriting what popular music was, while Dylan was transforming his lyrical while an entire generation of new artists was building on the foundation Elvis himself had laid, the man who had started rock and roll and singing songs about girls and cars that bore almost no relationship to what had made him famous and exciting in the first place.
Well, you ain't never gonna run and you ain't no friend of mine.
The NBC television special that aired in 1968 was originally planned as a conventional Christmas variety show. Elvis singing holiday songs in a comfortable, unthreatening format that Colonel Parker felt represented the safest commercial option.
What a chill I got. My lips are like a volcano that's hot.
Director Steve Freeman was back against that concept, arguing that what the special needed was Elvis
Well, send
performing
my baby
vital
love
rock
me.
and roll that had defined his early career, not the sanitized Hollywood version of himself. The negotiation between Parker's caution and the vendor's ambition produced one of the most significant moments of Elvis' career. Elvis appeared in the black leather suit, performing in an intimate setting with a small group of musicians, drawing on the early Sun Records material
My hands are shaky and my knees are weak. I can't see how I bleed. Don't ask me what's on my mind. I'm a little mixed up. I'm proud to say she's
The
mine. But I
broadcast
come
of the largest television audience of 1968 in the United States,
tell me,
and the
well, I
incredible
found a
commercial
new
response
place to dwell. I could die. Well, the bells
The 1968 comeback special reestablished Elvis as a genuine artistic
crying all the time.
rather than a nostalgic,
You ain't no trooper.
led directly to the most successful concert residency in service history, and reminded an entire generation why rock and roll had become what is one of the most first. It remains the definitive example of a comeback in rock history. An artist who had nearly disappeared
Who do you find a little mixed up when I feel fine?